You will regret this. It's a phrase that we've probably all said at one time or another. It might strike fear if uttered by the right person. In 16th and 17th century Scotland, it might get you killed. Thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft. Many were tortured, trialed, and executed. We can read accounts and analytical commentary of how people felt and responded to this apparent threat, but it's also recorded in stone. I've certainly visited a lot of cemeteries here in Scotland, and I can tell you, you're unlikely to find a gravestone that marks the burial of a confessed witch. There are some memorials that commemorate those put to death as witches, but they're fairly modern, more of a consequence of modern consciousness. All that is, except for one. Well, if you can call it a memorial anyway. In Scotland, there were nearly 4,000 cases of people being accused of witchcraft. Records are limited, but of the recorded 305 trials, 205 were executed. It was said that in Aberdeen, where I'm recording from, they burnt more witches than anywhere else in Scotland. But that might just be a case of good bookkeeping of horrific practice. Trials of witchcraft were brutal, unjust. They were barely based in anything other than hearsay or the motivations of those in power. At the Kirk of St Nicholas in Aberdeen, 45 women and 2 men were accused of witchcraft during the Great Witch Hunt of 1596 to 1597. 22 women and 1 man were put to death. Aberdeen's trials were part of a broader moral panic driven by religious and societal anxiety. People accused of witchcraft were often said to have cursed others. And although some men were trialled and found guilty, the stereotype of a witch in Scotland was, like elsewhere, that of a woman. They tended to be poor, over the age of 40, and might be accused for accidents or illnesses befalling people around them. But some could find themselves accused of witchcraft for healing people, animals, or even just speaking their mind. Many thought that women should be sticking to their own lane. Leave the difficult and intellectual tasks, like healing, to those capable, men. The idea of a woman that was capable of such things wasn't just problematic. For some, it simply went against God. Be it curses or seemingly supernatural abilities, there was only one explanation. The witch must have given herself to the devil. Inside this building, the Kirk of St Nicholas, there is a 15th century chapel, St Mary's Chapel. Within it, there is an iron ring set in a stone pillar. It's places like this where those accused were brought and tortured. The accused were tortured to the point that they'd scream whatever their captors wanted to hear, and that often included the condemnation of other members of their community. Interrogators would gather as much information as they possibly could from the now guilty person. They were then put on trial before they were strangled and burnt at the stake. To the south of Aberdeen, in a town named Torryburn in Fife, there was a woman named Lilias Addy. She was accused of witchcraft not once, but twice. The first accusation wasn't taken very seriously, as it seemed that her neighbour, a woman by the name of Jean Bezet, was just trying to blame her for a particularly intense hangover. But in 1704, at the age of 60, she was arrested. The authorities couldn't ignore the accusations a second time. For weeks, she was deprived of sleep and tortured in order to gain a confession. Eventually, she did confess. Her confession detailed how she had met with the devil, renounced her baptism, had carnal relations with him, and even how he had placed one hand upon her head and one upon her feet, declaring he now owned everything in between. Of course, it was her confession of having met with large groups of local witches that they were most interested in. It's often been claimed that she refused to give up anybody's names. However, she did give up some names. Most of them were women who had already been convicted and executed, but some were local women that were still alive, who were fortunate to escape with their lives. She could hardly be blamed. The entire aim of her captors and torturers were to make her say exactly what they wanted to fit their narrative. However, I would argue she had one fleeting win over them. Before she could be taken to trial, Lilias died in prison, either as a result of her mistreatment or potentially by her own hand. This presented the people of Torreburn with a dilemma. They had already gained her confession, they were certain of her guilt, but there had been no trial. As a result, Lilias was never convicted of witchcraft. Without the guilty verdict of the trial, they just illegally killed somebody. As crazy as it may sound, things still needed to be conducted through the judicial system of the day, and now they had to cover up their mess. Not only that, they hadn't disposed of her in the proper fashion, and they feared that Satan might be able to reanimate her, bring her back from the dead. Her body was described as spiritual toxic waste, a health hazard, and so in the intertidal zone, they dug a pit. They placed a wooden box containing her remains within it and placed a half-ton stone over the top. The stone was not intended as a memorial. It was intended to keep her from rising from the dead and terrorizing the local people. But it is a bit of an unintentional monument that marks their fears and their crimes. Her burial between the tides is somewhat symbolic. She was neither here nor there. In their eyes, not innocent, but not a convicted witch either. They simply left her somewhere in between. This isn't a stone marking the burial of a witch. This is unequivocally the location where a town, or perhaps more specifically the church, disposed of the remains of a woman they murdered. Sensationalized stories of people accused and convicted of witchcraft capture our attention and imagination, but they're false portrayals of real people, innocent people. The witch hunts were about ideas, and in particular, having the wrong ideas. The forming European states were seeking to establish moral authority, and they were willing to clean up their towns and cities by whatever means they deemed necessary. Witchcraft was just the name given for theological and ideological crimes, and moral panics were a way of eradicating it. A weapon that, with intent, turned neighbour against neighbour. These are stories well worth learning and remembering, and if we don't, we will come to regret it.